the other one, you bastard!
Brought to you by Robotoyz. More information in a moment.
This may seem like a weird second opinion to do at first, since the original wasn't done all that long ago in comparison to the other diagnoses in this sub-series. Well, truth be told, I was never happy with that episode. The editing was extremely lackluster, especially in the audio. So, I'm redoing it with all the new editing and contextual knowledge I have now. Also, this episode officially killed my old computer, so, hope you enjoy the end results. When Siege hit the scene in late 2018, everything was new. New aesthetic, new articulation, new sense of maturity and solidity, even the paint system was new. Welcome to the brand unification, baby. Paint budgets are getting classy as f***. Of course, at this point, Hasbro decided to shake things up a bit. They'd been doing the same old Legends lineup for years and years, and in their eyes, it was time for something a bit different. Enter the Micromasters, basically smashing the Legion figure ideology into that old lineup of figures that Hasbro made out of necessity due to the then current financial crisis. They may have occupied the Legends price point, but really they felt more like two Legions in a box than anything else, especially given the Battlemasters felt like their own thing. I was actually really excited for these when they were first announced. When getting back into collecting, the Airstrike and Sports Car Patrols were two of the first G1 sets I took a gander at. Years later, I've gotten a few more at least. Now these days, given my obsession with small-scale Transformers, I've sort of made it my mission to catalogue the entire lineup eventually. I'll likely never actually finish it off in my finite lifespan, but for now I'd at least like to re-examine an older diagnosis and rectify a few errors I made with my limited knowledge at the time. Greetings, Cybertronians, I'm DrLockdown, and today's diagnosis tackles another second opinion. In order to take a closer look at an oft-criticized lineup, let's examine the first two waves of the Siege Micromasters. Now I suppose I should go over the specifics of this lineup, since I initially relied on the original video for that, and this review is, well, replacing that. These sets came in packs of 2, retailing at approximately $19 each. If you follow the Legion pricing system, this is actually a pretty good deal. And make no mistake, these are Legion figures. They may seem smaller on average, but following the prevailing War for Cybertron engineering ideology, they're denser and end up with far more paint. Of course, this caused issues with their perceived value. People were pissed when they came out, but I won't go into detail on that in this video. I feel that's better saved for the eventual Earthrise diagnosis, recounting the downfall of the size class. Another story for another time, if you will. Actually, that's a saying that'll come up a bit throughout this review, for, reasons. Of course, one thing remains obvious. The original Micromasters were packed with 4 members, or 6 if you count the combining sets. These sets only pack in 2 of them, most likely in order to keep the price down. Such led many people to ponder whether they'd make the other halves later down the line. Many people even speculated the leaked Target 10-pack would assist in this regard, myself included, since back then we only had a Target SKU listing to go off. In hindsight, this was never gonna happen. Holding our breaths was a fool's judgment. It was probably a better idea to sit at a random bus stop in an effort to wait for Godot. I hope he likes my new hat. But well, we ultimately had what we had, and what we had was still very exciting for the time. So, how did the first wave fare?
He's going the distance. He's going for speed.
When the Siege lineup kicked into gear, the Race Car Patrol were pretty much the poster boys of this newish size class. If memory serves me correct, these were the ones primarily used for marketing and such. Out of the two, Road Handler was the one afforded the most attention. I suppose it's only fair given his bright red, and bright red tends to sell, unless you're Kingdom Inferno. Oh, you poor thing. Now, typically when it comes to G1 accuracy, I don't give two flying f***s. Grapple is bad, but is accurate to the cartoon, but is still bad. Cyclonus is great, and he is accurate to the cartoon, but his qualities are completely separate. When it comes to the Micromasters though, given these were a real big deal for me when I was getting back into collecting, I do ultimately feel the need to compare these to the originals. Sorry if y'all find it pointless, but this is my show and I can do whatever the f*** I want. Anywho, Road Handler is pretty generic, I'm afraid. He does the job alright, but he definitely feels like he's lacking in some areas. The front is pretty neat, with plenty of molded headlights and vents on show. Yes, there's no paint to speak of here, but we've got the sign ready and waiting for cases like this. This is actually a substantial deviation from the original, since although it's nice that they've exaggerated the boxiness, they've removed the downward slope, and the light layout is pulled completely from the designer's arse. Now, some of the changes on this design make sense, since it's sort of billed as an amalgamation of Road Handler and Hyperdrive, so they could get that use out of the mold later on. However, bringing both versions up to the plate, neither of them show off this design. And to be honest, I think I prefer both originals. That's not to say this is bad in any ways, just gotta list my personal preference. I will give props to the fact they painted all the windows at the back though. Sure, it's missing the split at the top pop thanks to the aforementioned pre-tooling, but it's still done quite well. Sadly, my copy got stunk with a bit of wonky QC with a smidge of paint bleed, but overall it's pretty neat. Ultimately, there's not a lot of detail on show, or at least a lot less than the G1 original, but on a figure this size I don't find myself getting too mad. This car is solid as a rock, meaning that even if the joints break down over time, the car mode will still hold together fairly well. Also, no annoying hinges on the bonnet, which was a fairly common thing for Micromasters back then. I dig it. Now, while I prefer the OG for the red fella over here, that opinion is completely the opposite for Swindler. This is one sweet car mode cast in a ridiculously shiny silver plastic, and pushing more boxiness than that one series produced by HAL Laboratory. Fans of the original might be a little saddened by the lack of vents at the back, and the diminished roundness overall, aspects that pull him slightly away from his great Scott origins. But as its own thing, I really love the aesthetic, and I get that the boxiness isn't for the sake of originality, but rather so they can redo him for his gambling cousin, but it's done seriously well. At first glance, you might think there's not much detail to speak of, especially with the lack of vents on the trunk. But take a look at the grille section, and all those panel lines reveal themselves to you. Sure, there's not much paint picking this shit out, but the designers really went nuts on this in a way that G1 designers could only dream of. And once again, solid as a rock. Can't say the same for old Wobble City over here. So overall, these are pretty neat car modes. I can't get overly excited for them, and ultimately I think their Decepticon redecos pull these off better in the long run, but they get the job done by introducing the masses to this new small-scale size class. I do kinda wish they tackled the other members, as beyond the notion that they're just more interesting, they fit into the cyberpunk aesthetic Siege was known for much better, but I understand why they didn't. Although chasing down that tangent for a second, I will die on the hill that Siege was going for a cyberpunk aesthetic over a Cybertronian one. We've seen Cybertronian alt modes. This ain't it, chief. I mean, you've got Blade Runner 2049, Alien, Coruscant, which totally counts as cyberpunk when you get to the depths of 1313, and, is Halo cyberpunk? Also, a couple of designers really seem to like Halo. But back on topic so as not to engage the wrath of the commenters a second time around, I understand why we got these cars over the others. These cars are definitely more repaintable, and on top of that, we already had a Space Countach to deal with. So in the end, I'm slightly annoyed, but fully understanding. Now, the conversions are almost one-to-one recreations of their G1 brethren. I suppose there's only so much you can do when you're dealing with figures this ruddy small. However, we need an emphasis on the word almost there. Swindler has a slightly different backpack transformation in order to facilitate a gimmick that we'll cover later. I get it, but as a result, the transformation is far more frustrating. It's not the end of the world, but with figures this small, I think it's important to ensure the transformations aren't an annoyance. It's a fundamental that's baked into the DNA of the very scale itself. Initially, I assumed it was a design flaw, but later on with the purchase of Blackjack, I realized it was a case of tolerances tweaked a bit too tight. BJ over here is able to convert smooth as butter, so it seems like a bit of an oversight on the research and development team. Oh well, at least these two look pretty good in robot mode. Right off the bat, you can tell the proportions have gotten a hefty upgrade. Road Handler stands as a fairly stout Autobot grunt character, which is fitting since that's kind of the vibe I got from the original as well. I'm glad that quality wasn't lost in the jump to HD, if you will. Although I do kind of miss the pronounced faux car hood section from the original, as although it's still here, it's a lot less obvious. But hey, it's still pretty neat. The head is definitely a lot sharper and is no longer wearing a giant blue diaper. Now you'll notice the yellow has been toned back quite a bit, thanks to it being achieved from paint as opposed to plastic. Far as I can tell, this is because these sets engage in a practice called gang molding. Don't worry, it's not a sex thing, I promise. Gang molding is when multiple figures use parts designed on the same sprue. For example, the retooled parts on the Takara Legends Fembot trio were allegedly gang molded, which is why they're all cast in clear plastic. I say allegedly because I ain't sanding down the null rays to confirm they're clear plastic. Great idea, terrible plastic choice. Brittle memories are never a good call. With this set, I believe the black sprue is the mold shared between the two. And if you're gonna complain about such a thing, just remember the old sets were gang molded too. This is why each set features palette swaps between each duo, so kudos to the War for Cybertron team at least striving to pick two different color schemes. I don't have many gripes with Road Handler over here. He doesn't have much interesting, but he doesn't do much wrong either. Well, aside from having a bit of trouble standing. These guys sadly lack any form of heel supports to balance out the giant backpacks. The backpacks are far bigger than their G1 counterparts, and that's perfectly fine, as are the hollow legs. That said, if you're going to do something like this, heel supports are a must. Plenty of War for Cybertron Micromasters pulled this off. There's not really an excuse here. Fortunately, it's not the worst thing ever, provided you can pose the arms slightly forward, which allows for an okay balance. Speaking of, the articulation is pretty decent for the size and price point. Of course, the incorporation of a waist swivel might seem odd, but that's to service the gun gimmick later on, so it makes sense on that front. Said gimmick also causes him to have a giant 5mm hole in his chest, something that was sort of similar on the original due to the screw hole, sure, but not to this extent. Much like other aspects of this figure, it isn't something I particularly mind, but I know some people will probably consider this an absolute deal breaker. To those, I pretty much bring out the sign again, but oh well, not everyone is going to agree. Still, as said earlier, there's not particularly much wrong with him. He's fine, just fine. Sadly, Swindler doesn't fare as well. Looks-wise, he's okay, I suppose. The head sculpt is pretty neat, and a massive step up in terms of definition from the original. Of course, they've gone for the same yellow seen on his partner in crime, so it's a little lighter, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It's not a good thing either, but honestly it gets the job done. The proportions and detail are alright, despite once again not having the fold-over torso like the original thanks to that pesky gun gimmick. I'm a little less forgiving this time though, since it's replaced by a great big slab of nothing. There's details here, but it's all haphazardly applied and doesn't draw your eye to any particular point. If they wanted to go for a faux chest for the sake of design, I can respect that, but they replaced it with something worse in the end. That, to me, seems a smidge annoying. Still, everything surrounding it looks pretty cool. It's definitely got more of a blackjack flavor than a Swindler one, with far more exaggerated shoulder stacks, but it works as a decent companion piece to Road Handler. Unfortunately, posing this guy is even more of a pain in the ass than his partner. The articulation is technically the same, but the shoulders really only move forward. The shoulder spikes aren't cut out very well, so there's virtually no outward motion. This also makes getting them out to begin with a pain in the ass. Not that you'd want to get them out anyway, because in any pose other than straight up, oh dear. Yeah, this figure is balanced fairly well when standing straight up, but thanks to those pesky pads again, once you move them slightly backwards with the arms going forward, he falls over like a former Australian Prime Minister in search of a Russian submarine. I suppose it's better than Road Handler, who can barely stand at all, but combined with the other annoyances, I don't tend to want to mess with this guy. All of the issues can be traced back to that pesky backpack designed to fold up for the weapon mode. To be honest, I don't see why they couldn't have engineered the old system, since both Blackjack and Swindler have it, but they had an idea they wanted to push, I suppose. And hey, if the weapon mode is amazing, it can all be forgiven, right? I mean, the old Thrilling 30 minicons did it well enough, so surely it can't be that hard. Well, apparently it is pretty difficult, because holy hell, this is a great big pile of Carnivac shit. It's a level of laziness that makes criticizing it difficult, because you can't particularly get all analytical on it. It's just two cars stuck together. What else do you want me to say? It's a lazy gun mode that doesn't look like a gun, or anything for that matter. And sure, it works with the blast effects, but who gives a flying I suppose you can also separate them into twin pistols, but they really don't look any better. Honestly, the community reaction speaks for itself. I've never seen anyone using the gun functionality. Already the Micromasters are forgotten, lost to time thanks to general lack of care, but when people do show them off, it's always in base configurations or in a whole team. Nobody ever uses these combinations, and you can see why. But ultimately, this set isn't the worst thing on the planet. You still get some pretty cool car modes and some wibbly but functional robot modes. They're just average, they'll do in a pinch. And hey, they're ultimately worth what you pay for thanks to their plastic density. I will die on that hill, and anyone who insists I move my grave elsewhere can f*** off. Now we'll get to the next Micromaster set in just a moment, but first, we have to discuss a quick tangent, because today's video is brought to you by Robotoyz. Robotoyz is an online Australian toy retailer specializing in all kinds of action figures, mainly Transformers, including mainline, selects, third-party, masterpiece knockoffs, you know, the whole works there. But they also specialize in a bunch of other action figures too. Now of course these sets have been off the market for quite some time, but if you want to buy anything else, don't forget to use the code DrLock 10% off at the checkouts. It's a single-use code that gets you a certain percentage off, and I think you can guess what percentage that is. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's discuss the next pack. Now, of course, back in G1, the military vehicles always offered more unique experiences in the Micromaster lineup. In fact, perhaps that's true of Transformers across the 37 years the franchise has been around. The planes and tanks always tend to have more interesting engineering than the simple cars and trucks. Not always the case, but it is quite common. Point is, though, the Battle Patrol fits pretty nicely into this ideology. These are much smaller and far more complex than any of the other figures in this wave, and even the retooled versions in Wave 2. As such, they're probably the smallest duo of the lineup, but I feel that works in their favor. These guys are covered in a ton of minuscule mechanical detail, which gives the feeling of a larger figure being scaled down to such a size in a way not really seen that often with the War for Cybertron small-scale figures. Yo, upscale Micromasters when? And I'm still waiting for my upscaled Astro Train. What's taken so long? Big Shot is easily the better of the two, although unfortunately in the years since his original release, they've sadly lost the license and he's had to be renamed Top Shot. Missed opportunity to call him Drop Shot for the few cred, but oh well. I still prefer the original name though, so I'm gonna use that. Big Shot has massively overhauled the design to the point where you can still tell where the DNA comes from, but it definitely feels more modern. Surprisingly, there's very little red hot DNA on show. Maybe the arms are a bit like that, but everything else feels like a proper classicified version of the Micromaster Classic, and I really dig it. The windshield area looks positively gorgeous, filled with greebles galore and a healthy dose of paint. And sure, you've got the knees visible, but in the way everything fits around it as if it's trying to mimic the spiked detail seen on Dark of the Moon Megatron helps a lot. Does this analogy work? I don't think this analogy works. The turret is also magnificent. They had to do the whole thing in paint since they didn't have access to the sand-colored sprue, thanks to the gang molding. Again, not a sex thing, I promise you. But as a result, it gets this really premium matte finish. And once again, it's covered with fantastic detail. Now, with the original, I don't have the gun that's supposed to go with it. I got this as a freebie, so I might have to hunt down the original someday. From image searches, however, I can tell that the gun's been massively reduced in size. As such, he's less of a big shot and more of a top shot, I guess. But honestly, I don't mind. There's one simple factor that makes up for all of this: blast effect compatibility. This was the moment where it all really clicked for me. The time where I finally understood how good this gimmick was. My favorite effect to use is still blowpipes. It's a shame this one never really saw a wider release outside of this. Well, it did, but for some reason it omitted the best parts. This just ended up as pack-in pineapples. Now, that's not to say he hasn't got any issues, but they're pretty minor in the grand scheme of things. You've got visible leg bits on the top and the arms are pretty obviously chilling on the side, a far cry from the cohesive original. Honestly though, this can all be solved with 3 simple words. Read the sign. Ultimately, he good. Not much to say here. He's a solid and well-proportioned little artillery vehicle. Flak, on the other hand, isn't quite that. Well, he's definitely solid, but well-proportioned? Most certainly not. To be fair, the detail on show is pretty good. You've still got all the rivets and flaps that bring in the same model kit aesthetic that Big Shot had, and he's got some pretty good paint, picking out the treads, the side panels, and even the missiles themselves, which for the size is positively mental. It's also neat that he got to keep his name, since the Flak name has been around in the copyright lineup since at least Dark of the Moon, although Hasbro did misspell the name during his announcement, according to TF Wiki. Unfortunately, he really wears his primary issue on his sleeve, or I guess his ankle. The feet form the turret section, and much like the original, it rotates upwards pretty easily. It's a nice complementary form of articulation to Big Shot's full turret motion, which can I say is also insane for the size class. And sure, the thighs are fully visible from the back, but at such a size, who gives a shit? The problem is that they look immensely out of proportion for a few reasons, both of which stem from a single fact. They prioritize the robot mode over the vehicle. Firstly, the proportions have been heavily shortened compared to his predecessor. I get why they did such, but as a result, this thing feels more at home with the likes of the Q Transformers than it does with the other Micromasters. This is exacerbated with the thickening of the boots, and exacerbated further by the fact that they can't even fold down all the way thanks to the added heel supports. Although, for that last one, I think we can let it slide because the functionality actually makes sense. As such, this ends up being a pretty silly looking alt mode. In fact, I think I have footage of a live reaction lying around.
Fold out, or is that how it's supposed to be? No, that's how it's... That's hilarious! Oh my god, that is just a hoot.
I have to put emphasis on the fact that this isn't a bad alt mode by any means, but it definitely looks a bit silly, especially next to the badassery of Big Shot. Still, it's a definite step up from the Car Bros, and a much better companion set for any base formers you might have lying around. And no, it's not just because tanks are more interesting than cars, they've genuinely got some cool stuff hiding under the hood here. That sentiment is echoed in the transformation with some pretty decent modern tweaks. Flak is much of a muchness, albeit with much sturdier joints, but Big Shot incorporates a few new tricks here and there. Overall, it's a solid conversion experience, and thankfully one where you don't have to deal with any annoyances.
Race car patrol!
In robot mode, you can see where the priorities went, because these fellas are hella clean. These are sweet updates to the 89 originals. Starting off with Big Shot, he's really had a glow up. The chest is a perfect marriage of paint and sculpting, reimagining the side chest pieces as a sort of cobbled together dual armor plate system, barely hanging on with the metal strips. They've even reimagined this tiny abdomen section as a fully realized faux grille. He's a wide and he owns it loud and proud. His arms also carry across all the awesome detail from the vehicle mode, only now with added posability, not just from the original but also from the cars. He retains all the articulation from the race car patrol, but also adds an extra shoulder hinge. This might not seem like much at first, but in practice it adds so much personality. That's not my favorite thing about the articulation though. No, that would have to be the stability. This guy is a sturdy son of a bitch with hella comprehensive heel supports. See, this is the kind of shit the cars needed. This shit is hella appreciated, and it doesn't affect the feet in any way either. These things still look hella cool with their big meaty clompers and heavy duty riveted thighs. I actually prefer the use of grey here. It gives him a much more war-torn feel. I also like how he no longer looks like he's wearing a big blue diaper. Damn, the diaper game was going pretty strong back with the G1 Micromasters. Did Hasbro have a certain fetish back then? Look, I'm not judging, just saying. Some people might complain that he's got a giant turret on his back, but honestly, that was the same with the original and the sign thingy again. Plus, this actually has some really neat functionality, folding over the head to access the cannon, something which the old version absolutely couldn't do. Fantastic, mate. This is what I live for. It's clear the designer was skilled in their craft, taking the base identity of Big Shot and improving on it in every conceivable way. If I had to think of any complaints, it's really just the head. It's supposed to turn, but getting in there is basically impossible. And even if you're able to, it has the potential to damage the paint and plastic. Not that it needs much help with that, though. It seems almost melted. I'm willing to bet this is more of a build quality issue than a QC one, since this isn't my first copy of Big Shot. I found this at Big W at the start of 2021. Quite literally, it's basically the first figure I bought this year. I got it to replace my original Big Shot, since his face was even worse. I also thought I could swap the limbs around to put the repro-labeled parts on the new version. But get this, there was a mold revision. They made the hips larger on later versions, so swapping out is impossible. No clue why they did this, since both have pretty good tolerances. Maybe it was to fix Red Hot later down the line? Fat chances, that flat out didn't happen. Well, yes, anyway. Let's see how the HasLab version turns out. Anyway, moving on to Flak, he's not as cool, but he still packs some radical qualities of his own. For starters, he also stands incredibly well thanks to the heel struts we saw earlier. And sure, because of these, the turret never sits fully flush. But thanks to this functionality, I'm perfectly fine with this now. Of course, he doesn't get as much posability thanks to the lack of waist articulation, but he still gets enough for the size and remains sturdy in any pose. Again, what the f***, Race Car Patrol? You had one job! One job! The head sculpt is pretty neat, all helmety and visory. Really glad they added paint to the visor, since that's something the G1 version appeared to miss out on. Don't own the original Flak to compare, but I assume TF Wiki uses the standard application. One place they've deviated quite heavily with is the arms. The original had the whole arm molded into the side, but here the wheel becomes the hand. I actually think this is a nice addition, especially with the extra guns on the side. Such a small blink and you'll miss a detail, it's f***ing sweet. Sadly, the rest is just okay. The chest has some great detail, but in this unpainted grey, I can't make out much of it. He also exaggerates the diaper aesthetic here, which looks pretty out of place. Look, I ain't one to king shame, but I'll always paint shame when I get the chance. The legs are sturdy as f*** and pack a lot of detail on their own, but ultimately they don't quite hold a candle to his partners. They're fine, I suppose. Still, beyond that, there isn't much wrong with him overall, and he makes a great companion piece in the set. Alone, these guys are pretty cool, but together, they're a neat team. Sure, I personally would have preferred a Sunrunner update in this set, but I understand the redeco potential isn't the best with him. For what we got, they do a good job. But honestly, if you ask me, the biggest surprise is the weapon mode. It's actually works! Sure, it's not the best gun mode I've ever seen, and I seldom use it along with all the other weapon modes, but this actually forms a cohesive gun. It's not perfect, a lot of bits don't have solid locking points, and thanks to the head tolerances, there's virtually no way to turn the head around, but if you're going in for the gun modes, this is probably one of the best. It makes a solid rocket launcher, and works great if you want to go for a solid snake homage. Of course, nobody really seemed to notice when I made a Smash Bros joke in the original, but that's on me. The joke wasn't properly blocked out. I suck at comedy. Still, ultimately, the best modes are the vehicles and the robots. Once again, I'm not sure the weapon mode justifies its existence. It's great if you want to go for that, but if that's all you're getting these for, just get a Battle Master. If you want these for either of the other two conversions, though, they do a bang-up job. They have their issues, sure, but in the end, I reckon these are secretly awe-inspiring. One thing I always found weird about the Micromaster lineup was that they started off somewhat devoid of Decepticons. Given these were essentially no-name grunt sets, it seemed like prime time for the cons to shine. But instead, the priorities were pretty heavily skewed. Ah well, the rest of Siege and the rest of the trilogy would eventually rectify these issues, I guess, so all's fine. I think I gave myself the hiccups with that laugh. No, I'm not even joking. I think I gave myself the hiccups with that laugh. Give me a sec, I need to take a break. The Airstrike Patrol team was actually one of the first Micromaster sets I ever received, if you don't count Crumbs or Purchase Order, that is. As Crumbs came with one of the toys that got me back into collecting, and technically I ordered the Sports Car Patrol first, but I received both at the same time. This was back when TF Source wasn't ruddy terrible, and when I was perfectly happy to order from their vintage pile. Good times, good times. Either way, I had a lot riding on these. Not nostalgia per se, although I do feel nostalgia for them these days, but definitely a sense of excitement. In terms of execution though, well, it's a tough call. It's not an easy this one's better case here. They both do good and bad. Starting off with the leader, we've got a pretty heavy deviation, and I don't just mean in the trademarking. To be honest, this is the one time I prefer the new name over the old. Vispa just sounds more unique in my humble opinion. But no, putting the two side by side, you can see a heavy deviation has been made to the general shape. This one sort of ends up looking like a futuristic blackbird, nixing the rounded wings and elongating the nose cone. It almost looks like an update of Cybertron Soundwave from certain angles. Through these changes, it's definitely a meaner jet, and that's elevated through the paint applications. Jesus, goodness, there's so much red on this thing. The deco design has clearly prioritized the vehicle modes here, for better or for worse. Ultimately, it's a much cleaner alt mode than its predecessor too, with no exposed hinges getting in the way of the aerodynamics. They also brought their A-game with the blast effect compatibility, and it works really well, although as a result they had to reimagine the stabilizers as a sort of engine block. Honestly though, I prefer it this way, and ultimately I think I prefer the newer jet as well. It is close though, since the old version is certainly more unique, and part of me will always miss the rounded wings and the more pronounced front winglets. I know some people dislike these, but I've always dug them, even if they serve no purpose in aircraft design. With Stormcloud though, you can't really compare the two at all. These are not the same in any way. The closest you can really compare is a slightly similar cockpit, the existence of front winglets, and the fact there are guns on the wingtips. That's really it. There's barely any identity of the original here. I do understand why. It's another case of creating an amalgamation for redecoing down the line. The dual fins at the back allow it to slip fairly well into the get over its airwave identity. Back to Stormcloud himself, you really have to judge him as his own thing. And as that, well, he's almost there. You've got a hefty amount of detail on show, especially towards the back. The designer really went nuts here, and I commend it. Unfortunately, it seems like Vispa stole all the paint budget. There ain't much to speak of. And where you do get some, it either seems inconsequential or chips like a I've barely messed with these over the years either. This just happened. Still, I suppose it's nice that you get no less than 5 blast effect ports on the back, as well as 2 more on the front. They clearly loved the gimmick and wanted to bring it to life with these figures. Would have been perfect with a stand port too, but alas, no dice. Neither of these have that functionality. In fact, the only Micromaster that really has any is the Astro Patrol, which we'll get to in due time, don't worry. These figures have punishment that needs to be dealt. Ultimately, there's not much to complain about with Stormcloud, but there's not much to praise either. The context surrounding him is more interesting than the figure itself, which is why I keep getting distracted with pointless tangents. Sure, he's got a pretty awful Silverbolt style undercarriage, but 1, so does Vispa, 2, the sign, and 3, every jet former on the planet has an underside, and I really don't want to keep bringing up the one time they didn't because I really want to forget. If I had to compare the original and the update, the original would win hands down for originality. That thing had class, whereas this is just a generic space jet. But alas, you can't really compare the two because they share so little identity, more so than any other Micromaster in the lineup when compared to its original. And as its own thing, I'm sorry, I've got nothing. At least the colors are lush, I guess, although even next to Vispa, they seem boring in comparison. I don't hate either of these alt modes. In fact, I quite like Vispa. I just don't think I'm particularly wowed by them either. Still, at least they're chunkier than the others, so I guess that's got to count for something, right? One thing I will praise is the transformation. The G1 versions were, suffice to say, boring as shit. These ones actually go through a few more steps comparatively, even if we've seen the transformation before, one on Silverbolts, one on the Silverbolts. So of course, great transformations should lend themselves to great robots, right? God damn it!
We were on the verge of greatness. We were this close.
Look, these aren't bad at all. They've got some great qualities, especially in the molding department. There's just one small problem. No paint. Take Vispa for instance, whose original version was essentially a giant plank of nothing. They finally pushed everything out and given it some nice layering. It's got a bit of a Lego brick aesthetic, nice and chunky. I think this really works, and you do get a bit of red on the side pipes to differentiate certain parts. Without any paint though, it ends up looking really boring. And sure, the original had no paint either, whether in toy or box art form. But as an update, this is why you can fix these things. G1 Toy has issues, rectify them at the update. But no, instead they dumped all the paint onto the jet mode and called it a day. It's a drastic oversight in my books, and to me, accuracy isn't an excuse. And sure, I appreciate that they've added a healthy dose of articulation, incorporating the same level as flak. The knees aren't part of the transformation, but they added them anyway. Nice touch, as is the inclusion of heel spurs. Not as good as the Battle Patrol, but still pretty neat. Sadly, you only get a bit of silver on the shins, and that's it. They had every opportunity to spice things up, and they didn't. Detail-wise, there's a lot of awesomeness here, such as the guns on the shoulders and the blocks on the knees, but in the end, it's all moot without any of it picked out. Stormcloud has pretty much the same problem. However, thanks to the color breakup, it's a lot less egregious. Now that the balance between the black and the purple has been fixed to a reasonable standard, he actually looks adequate at least. It's weird, I should be going nuts over him because this color combo is always a recipe for success, but unfortunately there's not a lot here to get excited for. The head sculpt is fine, I suppose. I dig that they kept the original green coloration as it's the most unique thing about either versions of Stormcloud, but there's not a lot of interesting tooling to begin with. The torso doesn't really reference anything. In fact, in general, this robot mode doesn't copy much from the original, save for the lines on the shoulders, which this time have been picked out in silver. Everything else is completely new, even compared to Airwave. It's pretty much a generic robot wearing the face of Stormcloud, which in itself makes me more harsh of the mediocre design, since they had every opportunity to come up with anything and they gave us this. I'm not too fussed by the huge backpack, given the nature of the design and the sign I keep pulling up, and I'm really glad they incorporated some hefty heel support similar to those seen on most others, but the legs themselves are just fine. The only truly interesting part here is the arms. They're far better articulated than anything else in this line, which I massively commend. In fact, I think this might might be the best articulated Micromaster of the entire trilogy. Well, duology. Kingdom kinda gave up on the line after that. But that's not the coolest part. Oh no, that would be the blast effects compatibility, going for the full GoBot homage. This is, quite honestly, a wonderful inclusion of the gimmick, and I really wish it was used on a more interesting robot. These guys just aren't doing anything that gets me excited. I want to go crazy over these, given my love for the originals, warts and all, but they're barely doing anything. There's nothing too interesting about their size, nothing too interesting about their tooling. Really, it's just the articulation and blast effect ports on Stormcloud. Ah well, maybe the gun mode will be able to save them. Well, surprisingly, they didn't go for a gun mode at all, but rather a combination that turns into Starsaber. Okay, not that Starsaber. Conceptually, this is pretty neat. It might not seem like much, referencing a random Minicon weapon combination, but keep in mind, Unicron Trilogy fans had been starved of updates for at least 3 consecutive years. And when we finally got updates, it was what appeared to be minimal effort retools. Sure, they were secretly brilliant, but the community didn't exactly see it that way. This was an exciting prospect back then. In terms of execution, though, the proportions are pretty whack. It's more cohesive, I'll give them that, but with only 2 members it ends up being way too short. Ultimately, this feels closer to an oversized knife than a sword, even with the swish effects port at the back. Yeah, that used to be a thing, swish effects. Seems like they just forgot they existed after Siege finished. I feel this would have worked a lot better if Stormcloud were a thinner jet to begin with, which is ironically what the original jet was going for even without the sword combination. It's not a bad combination, but it seems impractical and ultimately underwhelming. And that really is the gist of this set. It's okay, I guess, and there's not a lot that's quote-unquote wrong with it, but it's not a particularly interesting set either. I realize their G1 counterparts weren't very interesting to begin with, but somehow with all the modern design techniques at the designer's disposal, they've made them even more boring. They're a set that will do just fine if you love the way they look, but if you have even the slightest doubt, you'll probably just be bored like I am.
That's not a knife. That's a knife.
Now you can call the other Micromaster sets many things. Weirdly designed, lacking in identity, or even poorly engineered, but you'd be hard-pressed to find a set that's definitively bad. Well, that is until now. Enter the Rescue Patrol, the first retool in the lineup. How do these fare? Rancid! But you wouldn't know that right off the bat if you started off with Stakeout, which I suppose we should do. Don't try to correct me in the comments and insist I call him Holly. I've already been yelled at by the Scottish wizard bastard over that, and I honestly don't care. I do occasionally wonder how he's doing these days, though.
Thanks so much for your donation. I'm gonna use that money to buy more heroin. Stream's over, guys. Don't forget to buy me staff water.
Stakeout doesn't have a lot of individual flourishes of paint, much like his race car predecessors, but he uses that to fully coat all the windows, a far cry from what Legion collectors are used to. They've also painted the headlights in both red and blue, which is a massive step up from the singular red of the original. Speaking of, yes, I reckon I still prefer the original more with its far more angular look, but this boxy aesthetic is still nice on its own. The front is minimalist but sharp, not providing a ton of detail, but making the stuff it does use count. There are a few flourishes on the side too, with tiny vents and headlight hinges, although occasionally they're hard to notice with a big white square on the bonnet. Speaking of, yes, I have applied repro labels to this set. Initially, the text was written in the Cybertronian Siege was well known for. That's fine and all, but for some reason they decided to mirror the tamperagraphs instead of making new ones off the bat. This means the text, which reads police by the way, was backwards on the other side. Come on, mate, talk about lazy. That said, other than that, I can't really think of anything terribly awful about this release. It does its job well enough, or about as well as a police car can do if you want to acknowledge the corruption embedded in the system. My point is, it's not a bad update, even if it takes a few liberties. Red Heat, however, stinks. The original Red Hot was one of the coolest vehicles in the whole lineup, driving in with a Jerry Anderson vibe that couldn't be beat by any of his wavemates. Red Heat, renamed for copyright or censorship reasons, spits in the face of all that by forcing the aesthetic out of the Big Shot design. I don't even want to call this Red Hot because it barely feels like him, and that would be fine if they offered something new and interesting instead, but they didn't. Instead, you've got a sloppily painted window section that ignores all the existing tooling in favor of a big blue trapezoid. The concept is lazy and the application of the paint even more so. I guess it's neat that they picked out this top section to try and make it look like a light bar, but since it obviously wasn't designed for it, this looks more like an error than an actual design choice. I suppose it's neat that the side windows are still painted, but in these new colors you won't notice it thanks to the incredibly gaudy heel struts sitting on the top. Although sure, whatever, I can let it pass thanks to the sign and but I can't afford the same lenience to the ladder. This is awful. The rotation platform looks like a great big pile of nothing, and the ladder is a hollow mess that barely looks like anything at all, let alone a fire engine ladder. It's far from the worst small-scale ladder I've come across, but this thing is seriously poorly designed. They just had to use this hinge system to give it some extra length. on a Legion-sized figure, where it wasn't necessary. Great job, stupid! Look, I understand the limitations of the retool and redeco process. They obviously only had access to the grey sprue on the original, which becomes the white sprue on this release. I'm not expecting Siege Galaxy Upgrade Prime or Kingdom Mirage levels of character transformation. I'm just asking it to at least be on the same level as the original. In this case, it flat out isn't. I'm glad I got this one first because it made me appreciate Big Shot far more than I would have normally. This mode isn't the worst thing about this set though, and neither is the matchup of the wonky sizing between the two. At this size, I don't think scale comes into it, even if I personally would have gone for Sea-Watch over Stakeout to fix the lineup a bit. It's not even the fact that Stakeout looks closer to Movieverse Barricade than the original, angering G1 fans since they were still mad waiting for the Formula 1 version because it was apparently far more popular than the big screen counterpart. Yeah, sure, keep telling yourselves that. Hell, go scream in a car park for all I care.
Curse you, Hasbro! Curse you!
No, the biggest issue is the transformation. Now, when doing it on camera, at the moment, it's perfectly fine, but only because I've fixed the tolerances on the hips. Out of the box, these were a nightmare. Both Stakeout and Red Heat instantly fell apart during the conversion process, with no way to avoid it. With Red Heat, I understand. They didn't account for the paint in the tolerances, and as such, it's far looser. I don't excuse such an oversight, but I understand why it came about. Stakeout, though? I've got nothing. All the parts on him are new, so it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Of course, I suppose the robot modes are ultimately kinda worth it in the end. Sort of. Not really. They are pretty good, but they sure as shit aren't good enough to excuse all the other issues. Stakeout is pretty neat, lifting a hefty amount of details from the original whilst managing to tweak them to feel more premium. The head, chest, and legs are pretty much all one-to-one. He's got the same visor, same vest design, same knee blocks, it's all there. Fortunately, they've made all of them fit with the new realistic proportions. Doesn't feel like a long man anymore. Also finally missing the diaper too, continuing the trend. I wouldn't say he's perfect though, he still gets stuck with the same flaws the race car patrol have, the old bulky backpack and no heel spurs combo. There had to have been a design fix for this, but oh well. Ultimately, he looks pretty good. He also poses fairly decently, with a similar joint count to the race car patrol. The only difference is he swaps out the waist swivel for a head swivel. Personally, I prefer the latter at this size, but oh well. If you're a Stakeout fan, or even a Holly fan who can't afford or happen to have missed out on the Let's Say Go Man, he'll do fine. Red Heat also looks pretty good, although everything he does right comes with an asterisk. Essentially his Big Shot, but in red. A pretty heavy deviation from the original. Still, Big Shot was awesome, and as such, a bit of that charm is rubbed off here too. Sadly, the chest is missing quite a bit of paint, opting to lather it in white instead, but the detail is still all visible. Sadly, he no longer retains the fold-over functionality of the backpack, but he still stands okay thanks to the heel spurs, provided you fix the tolerances in the thighs. Yeah, there's a second problem with the looseness here. He can't stand for shit until you fix it. And sure, it is a fairly easy fix, and the issue is far from the worst build quality issue in the War for Cybertron trilogy, but it's still something they should have picked up on during the research phase. A figure should be able to fundamentally stand on its own, especially at such a small size. I can't be the only one who thinks this should be the bare minimum, right? Of course, my copy here works fine now, and he looks pretty cool. He even fixes the head sculpt issue with a much crisper design in comparison to not just Big Shot, but also Red Heat's G1 counterpart. The thighs carry across the retooling quite well, and offer a small deviation between the two, which is always good to see. But alas, in the end, when you take into account the tolerances and the frustrating transformation and the lackluster vehicle mode, I don't think it's really worth it. Not even the gun mode can save it, because in their infinite wisdom, they've slapped the worst weapon design onto the best handle, forever gimping it. This thing is a mess. I mean, sure, the arms actually peg into the sides this time, but everything in front of Red Heat is completely abysmal. If you're even slightly into this set, this is a mode that you should forever ignore, which I suppose is the same for all the other Micromasters. Although ultimately, I can't get too mad at them for this. We've only really found one weapon mode that works without any caveats so far, and in the Siege line, there's only really two in total that manage it. If we're going to criticize these, the problems are simple. Stakeout is another Micromaster carbot with slightly worse articulation and wonky tolerances that make transforming him a pain in the ass. Red Heat has an alt mode over by the slapdash retool and redeco process, and once again, tolerance issues, this time affecting both the robot and the transformation. It's at the point where I don't even want to call him Red Hot. They seem like completely different entities to me, especially in the alt mode. I reckon their infamy is a little exaggerated, but I can see why they shell-formed so hard. Yeah, fun fact, these are probably the worst case of overpacking in recent history. These released in early 2019 in Australia, and stores front-loaded so many purchases of this particular wave that you can still find them on store shelves to this day. Hell, my part-time job is at a retail store, and I won't mention where specifically, but before the pandemic hit for its second time at the start of 2021, they were still clogging up store shelves. And that was new stock too. It was a recently reopened store and we got stuck with them. Nobody wants these, and I get it. Their hate may be exaggerated, but of all the Micromasters to overstock, they picked the worst one to do it. Right off, Red Heat, mama. Mate, you sure look like shit to me.
Give me one meal, give me more. Give me one meal, give me
Siege did a lot of things right, but this would have to be one of the designer's smartest decisions. Putting the cassettes in the Micromaster lineup? Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. This means they're the appropriate size to fit into Voyagers without requiring the figures to tower over everything else in the leader class. Of course, the previous version of this review incorporated a mini review of Siege Soundwave to cover his shittiness, but I feel he might actually need a proper diagnosis sometime in the future, so this time around, I think I'll admit such. Point is, the idea is pretty great, but the execution for the first two is somewhat problematic. You wouldn't guess such in cassette mode though, because they certainly look the parts. Well, I say cassette mode, but Hasbro can't actually sell them as such to little kiddlywinks. Because of this, they are referred to as drone armor, and with a little fold-out peg they can plug into any 5mm port you deem fits. This has got to be one of the dumbest justifications I've ever seen, and turning them into iPads was already stretching it. Ah well, ignoring the shield functionality, these are painted quite well. Laserbeak actually goes nuts on the red, black, and silver. This looks closer to a custom job or a Repro Labels upgrade than a mainline transformer, and I really commend them for doing such. Of course, flipping it over reveals a sorry sight, but that's basically true of any cassette former on the planet, so I can't really complain. And sure, is easily outclassed by the Netflix version with all the extra layers of yellow and blue. Seriously, how the f do they even manage this? But if this is the only Laserbeak you have access to, it gets the job done pretty well. Ravage, on the other hand, is a bit rougher. He's not terrible by any means. The black plastic helps cover up many of the imperfections in the folding process, and there's a shit ton of silver on show. They somehow designed this in a way where all the cougar paint became visible here. Hell, they even added a smidge of purple in the middle. It's not something you'd normally notice, but it's hella cool regardless. That said, it all feels a bit aimless in the end. There's not much to differentiate one part from the next. Sure, there's a lot of paint, but it doesn't amount to much. As such, I think he ties with the Netflix version in this mode. It would have been an easy win for the elusive pack-in, but that version kinda cheaps out on the top half. So really, it's neck and neck. Still, either way, these do a good job of being space cassettes. Yes, space cassettes. I'm not dealing with the shield nonsense. I'm fine with them adding an extra functionality, but make it actually, well, functional. Anyway, these are pretty much the same size as any other War for Cybertron cassettes. Not much to discuss here. No, the discussion really kicks in once we get to the transformation. Laserbeak is basically a slightly streamlined version of his G1 counterparts, taking the backpack cue from the Masterpiece. It works great at this scale, no problems whatsoever. I mean, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Ravage, though... God, this guy's a pain in the ass. I mean, it's doable, but the sheer amount of specific part motion into play is far too high for a figure of this size. It's just not fun, and in the end, that's the most fundamental thing about a small-scale figure. It should be simple but fun. Ravage flat out isn't that. Fortunately, they do their job fairly well enough in Beast mode. Laserbeak is fairly elegant, with spot-on proportions for the price. It's amazing that they managed to capture his likeness so strongly.
Ravage is the chunk man.
I mean, hot damn, the paint here remains as insane as it did earlier. It's awesome how it's able to carry over, and works wonderfully with the silver thruster pack.
Ravage is the chunk man.
Now, yes, I know a vocal portion of the fandom is pissed off at the visor, but to be honest, I don't mind. Yeah, I prefer the more traditional face, but this works okay.
Chunk man.
Okay, you know what? That joke was reductive in the original video. I barely even took a look at Ravage initially, so I think it's important to set things right. Yes, Ravage pushes himself to the far reaches of the chonk chart. Not quite into the blasphemous territory, but definitely enough into the mega areas to make Megatron consider putting him on a diet in the future. And you know what? This is fine. It's virtually impossible to get Ravage to look completely proportionate at such a small price bracket. The fact that this is the worst he looks is honestly astonishing in itself. Expecting full Masterpiece quality at a $10 price tag is, to be frank, absurd. Even the bootleg MP costs $25. Not even knockoff companies can bring it any lower. And on the grounds of his own merits, he's still quite well done. As stated earlier, he's painted exceptionally. In fact, these two might be the best painted Micromasters of the bunch, if you can even call them such. I especially dig the fact that the missiles have been specifically picked out. On a figure this small, you'd expect them to skip such a flare, but they really went the extra mile. That's one of the defining factors that puts this above the Netflix version in this mode for me, as the missiles just kind of blend into the cassette detail with the later rendition. The other factor is the eyes. The original has red, whereas the Netflix one has silver. Looks super dead. Get that shit out of here. Surprisingly, he has a minuscule amount of posing too. It's not much, but it's still nice to have. You can use it to have him slouch about on the floor like the overweight slob he is, or fan mode him into a tank like the Iron Factory version. Speaking of, kind of odd that people say this is okay, but this isn't. Do I sense some oh-so-delectable double standards? No, that couldn't be possible. In the end, though, Ravage is fine. The Cougar mode isn't anything immensely special, but it makes an okay companion piece to Soundwave and acts as a decent enough update if you're a fan of him. That said, is the transformation to get here ultimately worth it in the end? Well, I'm conflicted on this, as whilst at my old job, I had a neurodivergent customer buy a second one because he couldn't figure out the conversion. He got me to transform it, then left one in each mode from that point onward. After that experience, I kinda realized something. I might like the transformation fine, but a lot of people probably didn't. It's not like Crimson Wings or some shit, where people know it's going to be complex going in. This is supposed to be a simple and fun fun Legends toy, and it pretty clearly fails at that. So in the end, I can't really give it a pass. It's not a bad toy per se, but it is one that failed to read the assignment properly. Fortunately, Laserbeak fares much better. I've already gone over some of his positives in the Chonk gag prior, but to recap, great paint, great sculpt, what's not to love? Well, for some people, apparently the visor. Yes, how dare they not make the exact toy that they want? An outrage, I say, huzzah! There's also a bunch of complaints that the wings aren't rounded, whereas the Cybertronian model had those, and honestly, I just don't care. It's a fantastic Laserbeak anyway, visor or no. Sure, I do prefer the classic eye look personally, along with the Netflix version overall, minus the lack of con symbol on the backpack, but I can't really get angry over such things. The end result still looks great, so who cares? I suppose people could also get angry at the lack of articulation, since he basically has none aside from some head hinging, but remember, these fellas are pretty tiny. What did you expect? Well, something you can expect is Blast Effect port compatibility, which he fortunately delivers on. Still, would have been nice to have a smidge of stand port compatibility. Much like the Airstrike Patrol, it seems like a real missed opportunity, especially since these things are supposed to be the next great step for Legion-scaled figures. That sort of functionality would have really put some of these above, but oh well. So ultimately, you've got a lot of good and a lot of bad, or at least a lot of positive attributes and one flaw that shakes the set to its core. Still, are these worth it in the end? Well, honestly, that depends. If you're looking for companions for either Soundwave, they'll do just fine. Although the Netflix version comes with them anyway, so I don't see why you'd need this release if you went down that road. Maybe if you bought a Soundwave on his own on the aftermarket? I don't know, that's how I got Skywarp. Someone only wanted the Battlemasters and ditched the rest. If you're a massive fan of Laserbeak or Ravage and need this set on its own, and knockoffs of the Masterpiece are wholly out of the question, then sure, go for it. They aren't the best, but they'll do just fine. However, as an impulse buy off the shelf, I'd personally skip them. Laserbeak's great, no doubt, but he is pretty simple. And as for Ravage, his faults are pretty obvious. Now, being part of Wave 2, these two experienced similar overstocking issues to that of the Rescue Patrol. Apologies to keep asking rhetorical questions, but do I think this was warranted? No. I feel a lot of the negative perception with these two comes from how many were seen on store shelves. If these were stocked in slightly smaller quantities, maybe they would have been received better. But well, that time is long past, not much we can do now. So at this point in the original video, I provided a ranking on all 5 sets. For this remake, I was partially tempted to nix the damn thing since I've already provided more comprehensive rankings in other videos, but since I want to erase that original video from existence, I think it's important to cover all bases. And yes, I know that's contradicting the Siege Soundwave argument, but trust me, I'll get to that eventually. In last place, obviously we have the Rescue Patrol. This really feels like an insult aimed at the designers of the Battle Patrol. Seriously, way to take an awesome design and pummel it into the ground. Can't believe these guys are being reused for the HasLab Star Saber project. At the time of writing this script, the project has just passed the 2nd stretch goal, and I think at this stage it's pretty obvious we'll surpass the 3rd one by tomorrow. Today being the 9th of October and tomorrow being the 10th. Great, we have to deal with these wankers again. Yippee! In 4th place, the Cassette Duo. This could have been an amazing set, but it's held back by unfortunate engineering limitation. It's a great accessory to either Soundwave set, but if you just want cassettes in general and don't care which ones you get, I'd stick with the 2nd unit, whether in stock or selects form. For 3rd place, the Race Car Patrol. These are solid. They have their issues, but they're a good primer set if you want to know what the lineup is about without going for the best one right out the gate. Although if I'm being honest, the Sports Car Patrol does these designs better. Guess the cons always get the better deco. Now, up until this point, the ranking has been pretty much identical to the original video. That's about to change though, because I'm swapping the Airstrike Patrol ranking for 2nd place. I reckon I was letting my nostalgia get the better of me at the time of the initial review. Sure, these have the best articulation out of any Micromaster set, bar none, but in terms of fun factor, they're a smidge lacking. And that's why the Battle Patrol now takes the top spot. I've become a lot more fond of these over the years, especially now that I've got one without a mangled head. Awesome vehicle modes, sturdy as robot modes with minimal backpack for what they're trying to do. Not the backpacks on these are that heinous to begin with, and an awesome weapon mode that can double as a rocket launcher or double bazooka or other side rocket pod or someone's other more bigger gun. Really makes me want to hunt down the other members of the G1 team, as well as fix Big Shot's gun. Seems a bit naked without it. But well, that's another project for another time. In later years, the War for Cybertron Micromasters received a lot of flack. Pun not intended, but you can see why when they first released, there was a lot of hype surrounding them. Well, at least I was hyped anyway. Maybe the community wasn't. But again, another story for another time. Point is, it's at least clear that this didn't start out as a throwaway project. There was an immense amount of care put into all but one of these sets. The designers clearly wanted to do to these what Siege did for the other size classes. Better paint, better sculpt, better articulation, even if it doesn't seem like much in the grand scheme of things. And that's why I personally remember the first 2 waves the most out of the whole lineup. They represented a more optimistic time. before the pain set in. And that's why, even as the years go by, I will always look at these fellows with fondness. They were a wonderful medium for small-scale creativity. And you know what? I think we should stay in this Micromaster world for just a bit longer. What say you? For those not aware, this review is part of the 4th annual Legendary Marathon. 25 days, 20 small reviews, 5 full reviews. This is one of the 5 full reviews, and tomorrow we're going back to a smaller release. We're gonna keep going with the Micromasters. I guess you could say we're going to stay on target, so to speak.